If you don't have a max CPA that you're comfortable with, well, as soon as you start to scale, the more budget you add, the cost per lead will start to increase. So yeah, you don't want to end up in what we call scale and jail.
This is the B2B Performance Marketing Podcast by Webmarketer, here to help you make the right moves with your B2B advertising. No spin, no smoke and mirrors, just honest insights from the advertising front line.
Welcome back. Today we're going to discuss a topic that happens to marketers far more than we wish it did. And that is that things are going well. Google Ads is working well for you, but all of a sudden things change and lead volume drops, sometimes by as much as 50% or more. So in today's episodes, we're going to talk through this and how we'd go about addressing and fixing this. Louis, do you want to talk about what you'd do in this situation?
Yeah, sure. The first thing that I always do is isolate the date when the change happened. There's going to be a day where if you look at your metrics in the ad platform, you're going to see a drop. I'd probably be looking at conversion volume, conversion rate, cost per conversion across, the last 90 days, just to see where I could see a visible drop in the performance. And I think it's worth mentioning that there's usually 3 or 4 categories that this kind of thing falls into. The first is going to be a change made in the ad platform, so a user-initiated thing or even an automatic application that Google has made. The second is going to be a change on the website or landing page, so the user experience. And then the third is going to be a market or a political condition, like an external factor. And then the fourth is going to be something to do with tracking, like a breakdown in tracking or something not working or something being different than it was before.
I think what's handy here then is how do we figure out which of those 4 it is? And we were talking about this separately. There's a way that you can kind of be guided in the right direction. So if all of a sudden your CPC has shot up, this is a really solid indicator that it's something inside of your ad platform. And then the other one that we mentioned is your conversion rate. So if your conversion rate all of a sudden plummets, then that's a really good indicator that it's off ad platform and it's something to do with your landing page or the conversion tracking.
I think it's really important that you start to build a picture of what's happened. So you're going to have a before state and you're going to have an after state. And what I'll typically do is I'll take a window of 30, 60, 90 days before the change happened, and then the same time window afterwards, or as long as possible afterwards. And then I'll start to I'll basically pull the Google Ads data into Looker Studio and start to really dissect where the change is coming from. What I'm looking for is is it a specific campaign that was delivering before that isn't delivering now? Is it down to keywords? Is it down to ads? Is it search terms that were being targeted before that aren't now? The other thing that you can do if it is a platform thing is you can look at the change history and see if there was anything that was changed around the date that the drop happened, to get a picture of, what could potentially have caused this dip in there as well.
Then when it comes to landing pages, depending on how much control over this you've got, that can become a little bit more tricky, because if you're not the person creating the landing pages, doing a lot of the web dev stuff in the back end, then you need to bring other people's experiences and what they've done and what changes they've made into the fold to see what changes happened that has impacted it from this point of view. You should be able to get a suspect list of these things changed and then identify, okay, cool, well, this one, and this one are the most likely, so we need to fix that. Or there's an option as well to roll back the clock and just have it as it was before, if that's possible.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because, we kind of talked about external factors as one of the potential causes of this. Google brought in, over the last couple of years, they brought in consent mode. And we've talked about it a few times on the pod where, you might be getting the same number of leads, but you're actually only able to measure a much smaller portion of them. So that would be like an external factor where your ads would look like they're performing worse, even though they might not be. There's also, when Google increases the CPC, so you end up paying more for the same amount of clicks. And I think it's one of those things that's really difficult, isn't it? Because when there is an external factor, like a change in Google, browsers changing their technology to make it more difficult to track things, changing in market conditions, changing in seasonality. Obviously, it's going to be cheaper to generate leads in a peak season than it is in a shoulder season. The political environment, all of these things are going to influence your performance. And in those situations, it's going to be really difficult to roll back the clock. Actually, in that scenario, you need to accept there's now a new normal. It means that all past data is now no longer useful as a benchmark. So from that point onwards, you're setting new benchmarks to move forward, and you can't look back on previous months and previous years and start to think, okay, well, we underperformed versus last month, we underperformed versus last year, because you're in a state of new normal where from now on, this is how things are.
Kind of going in on what Louis said here on, was it a market or wider environment change here? One of the important things is to make sure that you're looking at your ads and your landing pages first, rather than jumping straight to market or environment, because this is almost the non-reversible state, isn't it? You don't want to default to that place. So before that, make sure that you've ruled out that it's not the ad platforms, that it's not changes that's happened to the landing pages, and only at that point then go, okay, it's clearly an environmental or market factor, and then pinpoint what is the environmental or market change that's had that impact that's suddenly made your lead volume drop.
It's a really important point. It's too easy to blame external factors, and it's not always an external factor. So you've kind of got to get rid of all of the other potentials first before going there. I think it's worth mentioning, a lot of the time when we run through these changes, so for example, like there's kind of three that come to mind. The first one was when leads literally dropped by 50% month on month, and it was down to the conversion rate. So it was a website thing. And in that instance, the client was a software company. We isolated the day that started happening from. We used the Wayback Machine to go and see what the page looked like before and what the page looked like after the page where we found the problem was coming from. And basically what we found was that they'd redesigned the integrations page on their website, where all of the different integrations that this software worked with were tiled, and they all had click-throughs. But the change they made was that they changed the buttons to be a little bit prettier, a little bit more graphic, a little bit more subtle. And as a result, people were missing the fact that these product tiles were clickable. And so we reverted back to having the buttons being very visible, very obvious buttons. And that brought the conversion rate back, because people went back to clicking on the product tiles and then converting on the integration pages.
I think there's also another one that you should be aware of, and that's when quality all of a sudden takes a downturn. So we saw with one client before, they were still getting tons and tons and tons of leads, but the quality had suddenly just shot through the floor. And this was because Performance Max, that had been performing so well previously, all of a sudden found a new group of people and was going after these and optimizing more and more into this, and it was getting poor quality leads. And so a lot of changes had to be made to bring Performance Max back in line.
Do you want to talk a little bit about what you did there to improve the quality, Miley? Because I know that people will be having quality issues with Performance Max. So I think any light that you can shine on this is going to be really useful.
Performance Max is like a self-perpetuating machine. So if it sees that it's getting a good volume of conversions, then it's almost going to be like a terrier and go after that. So you want to try and get as deep as possible in terms of the quality conversions that you're feeding back, and that will help you point it in the right direction. The second would be, don't rely too much on Performance Max because of that. So almost always make sure you've got search in the mix as well as your Performance Max. The other one is, and it's quite manual, but it's almost the search term equivalent for Performance Max. That is to pull up a placement report inside of Performance Max and look at all the poor placements that are coming through and just exclude as many as possible.
And when you say exclude as many placements as possible, I know like by default, we exclude all mobile app placements. Is there any more guidance that you've got for excluding placements?
There's going to be thousands of placements, so you can't really look at all of them. There are things that you can do that are great. So for example, your .io, .pl or .xyz, so different countries that you actually don't want to be featured in, you can actually create a script to create a list of these automatically and then go ahead and exclude those. The other one is just look at your top placements, which ones are featuring a lot and maybe more than they were previously. Click into them, look at what they look like. And if they're clearly not right, for example, children's games, which come through way too many times than they should in Performance Max, exclude those, make sure that they're not coming in the mix.
I promised 3 examples. The other one that comes to mind is when everything was going well for this client. So what they did to react was to push the budget way up, which makes sense, right? You know, you scale the budget up when things are going well, but there's also always a risk of scaling the budget up too much. So for example, you know, you spend, let's say $5,000 1 month and you're really happy with how things are going. And then day one of the next month, you increase the budget to 10 grand a month. It's a big change. So Google understands the parameters in a fundamentally different way. It accesses new audiences. It treats it very, very differently. What should have happened was increasing the budget 20% a day until it got to, you know, double the budget if that was the target. And then to fix that, because what happened was the budget was dropped back down and the campaigns were performing worse than they were before. And so to counteract that, then we moved the bid strategy, which was on target CPA, back to max conversions for a bit. So slightly less aggressive so that Google could find its bearings again. And when it started generating conversions again at a decent rate, then we moved that target CPA bid strategy back into place.
Sometimes it's worth bearing in mind that you will encounter a hockey stick effect when it comes to scaling. You'll find that at a certain point, your cost per conversion is just going to rise and rise and rise.
Yeah, I know we've talked a few times on previous episodes about using a max target CPA that you're happy with and working from there rather than going every month trying to get a better cost per lead. Because the reason is if you don't have a max CPA that you're comfortable with, well, as soon as you start to scale, the more budget you add, the cost per lead will start to increase. So yeah, you don't want to end up in what we call scale and jail. Okay, so that feels like a good place to do a quick recap of what we've talked about. First off, things changed on a specific date. So you want to find the date where the lead started falling off a cliff. The next thing is to decide whether it was an ad platform thing, a website thing, an external factor, or a conversion tracking thing. There's 2 metrics that will point you in the right direction. If it's the CPC that increased that's causing the problem, then it's probably an ad platform thing. If it's a conversion rate thing, was there anything that changed on the website or on the landing page? Knowing which of these affected the campaigns is really, really useful because it lets you know whether you're going to be able to reset back to the before state or whether you have to accept that there's a new normal moving forward.
If you enjoyed this episode, then please subscribe or leave us a review. Every single one means the world to us and it really helps us to grow. And if you've also got a topic that's been nagging at you and you'd like us to cover, then head to webmarketeruk.com/topic and let us know for a future episode. Thanks for listening and catch you on the next one.